Okay, welcome everyone. It's a delight to be with you here today at Flyleaf Books. Let's give a round of applause for being in a place together. How wonderful it is to be in a live situation. And I welcome all of you on the other side of the virtual proscenium arch, if you will. We welcome you to this virtual event as well as the live event here, Humanities in Action. Today we are really excited for our talk. I want to go through a few things. First of all, to thank a few folks, including the Cotton Merca Group at Morgan Stanley, a wonderful underwriter, especially of our K-12 programs. I would like to thank the North Carolina Linneana Society for underwriting also our K-12 programs, in particular our William Friday Teachers Retreats. Carolina Meadows has been supporting our public programs for a number of years. We're grateful for their support, and we're also grateful for the support of the General Alumni Association at UNC. And remember, folks, anyone can be a member. You don't have to be an alum, and they have a wonderful set of discounts and programs and promotions themselves. So check that out, and thank you to all of those sponsors. My name is Max Orr. I'm Executive Director for Carolina Public Humanities, and it's a great pleasure to be working with Paul Bonici back there. Let's put our hands together for Paul and all he does, making sure you folks on the other side can see and hear what we're doing, and also Vicki Breeden. Round of applause for Vicki, who makes sure that all of this runs and does all the logistics behind the scenes. I mentioned when I was talking about thanking some of our sponsors, I had mentioned that we have different aspects of our program. I should just remind folks of all of I recognize just about every person in this room, so they've heard this before, but perhaps some of you out on the other side haven't heard exactly what Carolina Public Humanities is, who we are and what we do. We're the public outreach arm for the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's our job to find scholarship and faculty at UNC and other area institutions, and to create these situations for humanistic dialogue and reflection out in many communities. And we do that, of course, through these programs, and I'll mention a few upcoming programs, the public-facing programs, a lot of those, but we also do it for for our teachers through our subsidiary Carolina K-12. Which I mentioned has teacher workshops, and we of course have an extensive community college outreach program as well, in which we're bringing scholarship all the way out to the 58 different community colleges around the state to make sure that this university, the University for North Carolina, exists not only just on campus up the hill, but throughout the state. So we're very happy to do that, and we thank you for being here and supporting that. I'm going to ask Paul to drop in a little information on giving to the program if you're interested in helping us, especially with our work with teachers and community colleges, which we provide entirely free to those communities. So if you'd like to help us with that, we're grateful for your support, and thank you for considering. I mentioned a few upcoming programs. The Humanities in Action series that we're involved in today is hot button topics, if you will, issues that are currently in discussion, including today's topic, of course. And just today, of course, we're going to be looking at misinformation in science and misperceptions of misinformation, and we'll learn the distinctions there today, I'm sure. But coming up, we have Seeking Truth in an Age of Distortion about political epistemology, social media and democracy, critical race theory and the law, and teaching hard history in K-12 education. All topics that you might have heard circulating around in the public sphere a little bit. We also have our weekend seminars. We just had a very successful weekend seminar, our first of the semester, and our first with a live audience in a very long time. That was with Gerhard Weinberg this last Saturday. Our next weekend seminar is coming up on October 9th. Featuring the esteemed Bart Ehrman, famed religious studies scholar, who will be doing a whole talk on the Book of Revelation, just because we like optimistic topics. If you're interested in something a little bit more uplifting and would like to join us for a virtual-only program, we have another version of another episode of Lunch with Friends and Strangers coming up this Friday at 12. We'll be talking with Charlene Register about singer, actress, and activist Hazel Scott, an absolutely fascinating figure in American history. So if you want to tune in to that, come on down, 12 o'clock. If you want to register for that, go to humanities.unc.edu. You can register for all of our events. Before we get into introducing our speaker, this is something I haven't had to say in a really long time, because usually our audience has been totally online, and we wouldn't want to tell them this, but I'm going to ask my dear friend Bob Kuykendall to tell everyone in the room, please turn off your cell phones. That's right. That was Bob's job back in the day. You got it back. You got it. He's been on furlough for a little while. So If you are watching on your phone at home, don't turn off your phone. Okay, let's get right to it. We are really, really lucky to be working with our scholar today. It's absolutely fascinating to welcome Brian Southwell, Senior Director for Science in the Public Sphere at the Research Triangle Institute. Dr. Southwell has a PhD in communication from the University of Pennsylvania. He is also an adjunct associate professor with UNC's Gilling School of Public Health and works with grad students at the Hussman School of Journalism and Media, especially in science communication. You can catch Brian Southwell on WNCU-FM on his show The Measure of Everyday Life. The show airs weekly on WNCU and focuses on intersections between social science and public discourse. He is the past senior editor for Health Communication and the prolific author whose works include Social Networks and Popular Understanding of Science and Health. As an author and as an editor, contributor to Innovations in Home Energy Use, a source book for behavior change, and Misinformation and Mass Audiences. I think we picked the right person for this particular topic, and we couldn't be happier to welcome Brian Southwell to the Humanities in Action stage. Please take it away, Brian Southwell.
Thanks so much, Max. I want to express my thanks and gratitude to Carolina Public Humanities and to Flyleaf as well. And I want to thank all of you, frankly, just for trying and for trying to offer an opportunity for us to come together online and for us to come together, here in person. I know it hasn't been easy. It's not easy. It's a little bit inconvenient today as we all are gathering in masks. But I think we're here for an important topic, and it's one that, in order for us to make progress moving forward, we are going to have to all pitch in, and it's going to be very important that we connect with neighbors and that we think about what can be done on a local level. So I want to offer a few remarks that are going to help to put, I think, this topic into a bit of historical context, which I think is quite useful. And hopefully to have us leaving here today with some degree of hope and optimism about some possibilities moving forward. This is certainly a topic that has been in the headlines quite a bit. As we think specifically about health and science, there's been a lot of worry and consternation with regards to misinformation. So much so that the Surgeon General's office issued a report this summer that actually declared health misinformation as a threat to our public health. And we were fortunate to have some of our work actually cited in that report, and so I fielded a number of calls and inquiries from people. And one, though, that was really fascinating was a large county government out west that actually was quite interested in acting on some of this, this announcement. And the question that we got, though, and the question I got in this phone call was essentially, where do we even start? What is it we can possibly do? This seems like we're at this existential moment. What can we do? And I think part of what we can do is to recognize the old challenge that we face with regards to misinformation. And you'll see some ways in which I'd like to trace not only the problem to different aspects of our public sphere, but also to thinking about each of the roles that each of us plays in it, as human beings and our relatively old humanity. And I think that's going to be something that's going to suggest there is a challenge that we face here that we've faced for a long time, but also that there is a path forward that is rooted in our humanity. And that's another reason why, in a lot of ways, this discourse and discussion today I was looking forward to, and I think there's a lot here that, that we can raise that isn't necessarily of a technical nature. It's not necessarily thinking about various aspects of peer-reviewed science as much as it is thinking about our connections to each other. And you'll see what I mean by that in just a moment. Aside from health and science misinformation, there's been a lot of hue and cry with regards to misinformation more broadly, of course, in recent years. A lot of this has happened with regards to our civic sphere, as you think about politics, as you think about the ways that we interact with one another. And there's been a headline level attention to the concept of misinformation. So much so that in 2018, the Washington Post went so far as to name misinformation as their word of the year. And in fact, they weren't actually alone in doing that. Several media outlets referred to misinformation or some variant thereof as the word or concept of the year. And this is, there are a lot of reasons for that, and there's cynical and discussion we might have about the extent to which the concept itself has even been politicized and used in different ways. But I'd actually like to suggest that our concern about misinformation extends much beyond just the last few years. That if you stretch back in time and history, we can think about this as an old concept. In the last couple of years, academic research has started to draw attention to this notion. We've started to ask important questions about where is it that misinformation comes from, what we do to actually stop the proliferation of misinformation, how can we curb its effects, what can we do to stop people from sharing misinformation, and as we think about the diffusion of this phenomenon as being a really problematic part of what we're facing. But what I want to point out here today are the roots of this concern. If you think about, even just for a moment, examples that will readily come to mind, it's certainly not been the last few years in which we've only been able to point to examples of false or inaccurate claims, or of what we might think of as misinformation. And as you might think about health and science specifically, there actually are even some precursors to current turns of phrase that we use now that are directly related to this concept and this notion. If I were to say, to you, as we're walking out, that so-and-so is a real snake oil salesman, chances are you wouldn't view that as a compliment. I wouldn't be speaking very highly of that person, probably. You'd probably have a sense that I'm talking about that person as potentially a fraud. That notion of a snake oil salesman is actually rooted, though, in real history. It is rooted in an instance of fraudulent marketing that actually was precursor to some of the regulation that we currently have of our health and medical advertising in the United States. There were efforts, as many of you will be aware of, to actually promote and sell snake oil liniment. And this was both the product itself turned out to be fraudulent, didn't actually often contain snake oil, but then there were fraudulent claims made about it. But it's a good example of an instance in which people were attempting to sell people a bill of goods, and there was a lot of worry and concern about that from an ethical standpoint. Move ahead in time a few decades from that original advertising, and there are lots of examples, but one that I like to point to happened around this time of year in the late 1930s, and it was in the Northeast, a relatively cool evening, and a lot of people turned into the radio at night, and they happened to hear a story, or what seemed to be an unfolding news story, because they had missed the beginning of the program introduction to the dramatization of H.G. Wells' novel, The War of the Worlds. And Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater Players had actually put on this dramatization, and the way it was depicted was quite realistic, as there were interruptions into the otherwise variety show that was playing that suggested, in fact, that aliens were invading New Jersey. Now here's the spot where I offer no comment on people that you might know from New Jersey and whether or not that could be true. But there was a lot of concern at the time in the country about what this suggested about this newfangled medium of radio and its potential power to mislead people. And so this is an interesting example because we have been worried and concerned for quite some time about new technologies and about the potential for people to get a hold of those technologies and to use them to announce false information, to mislead people in ways that we might be worried about and concerned about. Right around that same time, there actually was a political cartoon that appeared that I like to point out because it's surprisingly prescient relative to the current moment. And here you'll see this. I'll blow this up on the screen. We've got concern about essentially society being led over a cliff by virtue of misinformation. Now, the issue at hand at the time was smallpox vaccination, however. And this was, even back in the 1930s, quite a bit of worry about misinformation and the impact that it was having on our decision making, the impact it was having on our public health. And so this is not actually an issue that we've only been worrying about for a year or two. This is an issue that has been out there for a while, but we obviously still haven't solved it yet, right? And so there are different aspects of this that we need to ask about. Why is it that this has been a longstanding concern? Why is it that this continues to be such a challenge? And just to go back to our timeline, I want to point out that I don't want to suggest that there's nothing unique about this current moment. There are aspects of our current landscape, as we can talk about, that really have exacerbated and accelerated the spread of misinformation in very important ways. But nonetheless, those that are able to capitalize on the moment to diffuse misinformation are taking advantage of certain ideas about our humanity that we've known for a while. And we'll get to an example of this. You'll see on the screen a picture of a woman by the name of Belle Gibson. And she's a good exemplar for the current moment because she rose to fame by virtue of her social media activity. Her story is known, for the most part, in Australia. Some of you might be familiar with it, but I'll introduce it to those of you that haven't heard it yet. But it's a tale that actually, in a lot of ways, holds in common with the other examples, the audience, and the fact that we are complicit on some level in the proliferation of misinformation. There's certain things about our own humanity that really sets the stage for the spread of misinformation. So you might find it curious that I've spent a fair amount of time here introducing this topic already without really being clear about what I mean by misinformation. What actually is it? And this is a question that I think is very important for us to ask. But I want to point out it's a question that I don't think it's asked as explicitly as it ought to sometimes. In fact, you'll see lots of references to misinformation in headlines where there is an implied definition. You'll see lots of worry and concern about this by virtue of pundits labeling certain things as being misinformation, to the point where it's become almost hopelessly broad, and it's come to mean something akin to just information that you disagree with in some way, or that you don't find particularly palatable, or that aligns with your own viewpoint. And here, I think it's important for us, as a research community, as folks thinking about this issue and dilemma, to offer some distinctions and to offer some definition here. There are two dimensions of this that I want to point out. The first is that I find misinformation to be a useful umbrella term to cover the wide range of false claims and noise that's out there that seems to be problematic, that's leading people astray. Within that, there is a special category of false claim that we might particularly worry about from some ethical perspectives. And you'll hear that referred to sometimes as disinformation. And here, you might think about instances or situations where people intentionally are misleading people. And often there's a caveat that we're aware of authorial intent, that we actually can explicitly point to an active effort to mislead people. And we certainly need to worry about that. And we certainly need to be concerned about that from an ethical standpoint. But I also think there's a lot of well-intentioned false information that's out there. There's a lot of mistakes that get made, even in earnest journalism. There are instances where there is a mistranslation of a research finding that really leads to a misunderstanding. And that's important. And it's also the case that science itself is iterative and is constantly being updated on some level. We are constantly moving forward in terms of accumulating evidence. And so it's also the case that sometimes what was accurate in 1985 might be less accurate now than it once was. And that's important for us to keep in mind as well. So in defining misinformation, it's probably important for us to think about situational context, to think about timing, and perhaps the best we can get to is a point of realizing that this is, if we think about misinformation, it's information that's actually counter to the best available estimate that we might have, say in the case of science, on a particular topic, our best understanding of that. We might think about it in terms of scientific consensus, but that's not always necessarily possible. But here, we're really particularly worried about claims that are counter to other information that's out there that has been judged to be correct. Now, that leaves the door open for some level of disagreement. You'll note that I've not actually pointed at situations of absolute truth per se. And that's intentional, because I think that there's a larger philosophical debate and discussion we can get into. But at the very least, we can worry about situations where people working professionally in science and health have endeavored to accumulate evidence. They have a relatively good handle on a particular issue, and others are just running counter to that with other claims that really aren't backed up by evidence. And so on some level, sociologically, it does become a bit of a clash or a contrast between various groups. And so there is a sociological angle to this that I think is important for us to keep in mind and just to acknowledge. That here we are often talking about situations where one person has decided to run counter to the norms of science and to make claims that really are not substantiated, and using the certain evidence rules that other communities of knowledge have decided to use. We can get into that and talk about that a little bit later, but I just want to acknowledge here that I do think we can sometimes get into trouble by assuming that certain groups somehow are just in possession of this magic absolute truth per se. Instead, I think we need to ground this in our everyday social interaction and in human society, and to recognize that the problem of misinformation is it's a dysfunctional problem. It's a concern, but it's a concern when you've got some people that essentially are running counter to what's been generated through the practice of science or other means of gathering evidence that have been agreed upon. So I want to suggest here, and here's the perhaps slightly depressing part of my remarks, which will then lead the way towards hopefully a more optimistic view. But I do think there are good reasons why misinformation as an issue and as a concern is not going anywhere anytime soon. There are good reasons why this is not going to be an ephemeral moment where we were worried about misinformation in 2021 for a brief moment, and now we've somehow gotten rid of it. And this is because of the nature of the issue in a lot of ways. I think it's important for us to, and I'm going to outline 4 claims here that I think are good reasons why misinformation is going to be with us. The first has to do with our information processing tendencies as human beings. We tend to process information at face value, at least for a moment. This is not to suggest that we don't have critical abilities. We all do. You all do. But by and large, cognitive psychology suggests that actually we first have to encounter information, and to make sense of it, we have to process it, and we essentially take it at face value. Doesn't mean that we can't later tag it as being true or false. In fact, that's what we tend to do when we're motivated, when we have the ability to do that. But at least there's a brief moment there, and you can think about the amount of time it takes to actually click send on Facebook to share it with 1,000 of your friends. We might leave the door open under some circumstances. When we see something that really resonates with us, we're all vulnerable to actually accepting this information, in part because of the nature of how we process information. Now, it's always a challenge for me to make the claim in a room of smart people here, that to point out that we all accept information at face value, and that's a problem because it means that we can accept misinformation, because it undermines my own credibility here. So, right, so very quickly I can say you all are going to believe whatever I have to say, but I'm hopeful that when you've had time to reflect on this and to think about it critically, a lot of this will resonate as well. It's also the case that we are, as human beings, we are social beings, We want to be together in a room when we can to talk to one another. We want to connect with people online. We want to connect with people during the pandemic. That's just our nature. That's important. But I want to point out that we talk to each other for a variety of reasons, and not all of them really just have to do with our interest in sharing facts per se. And here's an example from the days prior to the pandemic, hopefully days that are coming back, again, sometime soon, that I think really illustrates this point. You can remember, many of us can, in a situation when you got onto an elevator and you saw, somebody else got onto the elevator, and let's assume for the moment this is somebody you want to actually talk to, and not just look down at your phone and ignore. And so you get into a conversation with them, and the two of you go on and talk about the weather outside. Now, in that situation, you both were just outside. You are aware of what the weather is. You're not sharing new information. Why are you bothering to say anything at all? You're acknowledging that person as part of your community. There's a certain degree of ritual, conversation that's meant to signal we are part of this shared identity. And if you stretch that a bit to think about what people are doing online, I don't think it's too far of a stretch to suggest that part of what people are doing with information is that they are practicing, they are engaged in, they are relating to one another, not necessarily through sharing new factual information as much as they are using that information in order to bond in other ways. Information is currency for those relationships. Along the way, you might end up actually inadvertently sharing information that people hadn't heard or misinformation, but at least part of that practice, people are not very consciously necessarily always carefully thinking about the exact truth or accuracy of what they're saying. I think it's fair to say that. You think about the nature of sensational discussion or rumors or other cases where people are gossiping, and this is true often. It's also the case that we live in the United States in a relatively free and open society with some challenges, but nonetheless a society that we often are going to characterize as a democracy. And our regulatory approach to our information environment is special in a lot of ways, and it's something to celebrate. But it's also important to point out that it leaves the door open for misinformation. Our regulatory approach to our information environment is such that we actually detect problems and deal with them, but we do so in a post hoc way. So we have many systems that are set up to actually point out that there's a problematic advertisement on TV that made its way onto TV. And there's going to be a remedy that's going to be necessary. You've run afoul of what the Food and Drug Administration says that you can do. You have violated the possibilities for what kind of content can be on TV. And there's going to be a remedy that's necessary. That's different than preventing that content from ever getting out into the environment in the first place. And particularly online, it's possible for information to essentially leak into the system. And this is important for us to keep in mind. We probably would not want the alternative. The alternative would be a situation of censorship. So we have to live with, and we're living with, a situation in which there's a certain degree of leakiness in our information environment. And I only point that out, I point all this out, because I think it's the basis for a compassion and an empathy for our fellow citizens that is going to be necessary, that I think a lot of us lack at the moment in thinking about and shaking our heads at the outlandish behavior that's happening as a result of misinformation. So partly what I'm trying to do is build a case here that actually we are all human. We are human in ways that are important to recognize our information processing, but it's also important to recognize our social tendencies. We live in a country and an environment where misinformation is going to pop up. It's possible for it to occur because it's not going to be prevented by our regulatory structure. And the last point that I'll note here is that we know that we actually can correct misperceptions that are out there. You can fight misinformation with corrective action, but it's not easy to do. you actually have to be pretty explicit. You've got to fight fire with fire, and what I mean by that partly is being direct about saying something was an error and pointing that out, and you also have to reach the same people that were reached by the original misinformation. If you've got some careful caveat posted on a website somewhere, that's not going to really, it's going to pale in comparison to something that's gotten 15 million hits online. And so you've got to think about the extent to which your corrective action is explicit and has attained the same level of exposure. So all this suggests that we've got an endemic problem probably with misinformation, that this is going to be part of what we're going to be living with by virtue of the nature of the society that we have and our technological tools. And we live in a moment where it's easier than ever to share information with 1,000 of your closest friends online with the click of a button. So all this suggests there are reasons to be concerned, but those reasons for concern are rooted in our human nature, and there's a pathway forward. So I want to unpack a few of those thoughts just a bit further, because I think some of you might be interested in that, but also to kind of flesh out this situation that we're in with some more detail, and to root this in academic research and thinking about history in terms of philosophy and psychology and other aspects. One claim that I want to make here is that in thinking about what people do when they encounter false information, I'm hearkening back to my earlier point about us being biased towards information and accepting it at face value. There's a long-standing, you can think about the contrast between what, on the one hand, a philosopher by the name of Spinoza had to say about how it is that people encounter information, what happens, versus an alternative view offered by Descartes. And the quick nutshell version of this is that Descartes essentially gave us a lot of credit for having a filter, for essentially being able to screen out false information before we really ever knew about it. Essentially, we kind of know it when we see it. We don't need to worry about this because people have an active filter. Spinoza thought it was possible for people to similarly be critical, but he's really credited in a lot of ways with this idea that there's a bit of a hesitation. There's a waiting room, if you will, where information is processed, and then we tag it as being true or false. In order to actually be exposed to information at all, on some level philosophically, you need to accept it as the reality of it, and that's essentially what Spinoza was arguing. And now we've later found out that through mapping the brain and thinking about the activation of different resources, there are different parts of the brain that get activated in sequence over time, which means that initially when you're encountering information or misinformation, you are accepting it in a sense before necessarily critically labeling them. So that's interesting in terms of the way that we process information, but you fast forward ahead to a moment where we have the current tools and technologies available for the spread of information and misinformation, and this is a problem. This is something that we might worry, be concerned about in some ways. It's a vulnerability that we have, and you might think about the ways in which social media and other aspects of our technological life take advantage of this. Earlier, I pointed to the story of Belle Gibson. I want to come back to that story here because in a lot of ways, the Belle Gibson story is a good example because there's an obvious angle to this that a lot of you will be worried and concerned about. And yet there's another angle to this that actually has to do with, I think, our path forward. So Belle Gibson is a woman who rose to fame, or rather infamy, really both, in Australia a few years back. And the short story on her rise to fame is that she had a lot of claims to make about having overcome cancer in her life. And she gained quite a social media following with her stories of, I'll euphemistically say, using nutrition to overcome cancer. And unfortunately, there's a problem with the Belle Gibson story. There are multiple problems, but one of them is that it turns out she never had cancer in the first place. And the whole thing was a fraud. A well-constructed one, perhaps, but nonetheless a fraud. And so she was on, national television in Australia, the headlines, people, this is a really dramatic story in a lot of ways. I had the good fortune prior to the pandemic to go spend some time in Perth to give a keynote address. And actually, as it turned out, there was a development in this case right around that time. And so I was able to see this was really in the news and people are concerned about it. But a lot of the finger pointing was at Bill Gibson. How could she have done this? This is awful. And this is not to suggest that she didn't do something wrong. She obviously did. This is ethically really problematic. But I also want us to take seriously the idea that she needed to have an audience, right? And again, this is not to necessarily blame that audience, but for us to think about how was it that she actually rose to the position and stature that she had. She had something to say that resonated with people. What was it that she was offering? Well, in a lot of ways, she was offering hope. She was offering hope in the face of a very challenging disease that's caused heartache for so many people. And she was offering a way of making sense of the world that seemed to resonate, and that's important for us to keep in mind. Because there's something about what we are looking for in these stories that suggests why it is that some misinformation takes off and flourishes and some of it doesn't. Not all of it is equally problematic for us. Not all of it diffuses around the world as quickly as some of it does. And that's important for us to keep in mind as well. Misinformation is not monolithic. Some of it gains more traction than others. So I think it's probably fair to say that we actually probably misunderstand a lot of aspects of this, but some of what we might misunderstand are our own vulnerabilities. I think that, as we've noted here earlier, we need social connection. It's not too hard to make that case, unfortunately, after the last few months that we've been through. We need hope for the future. And when we lack those two things, that is the circumstance where misinformation can proliferate insofar as it offers a salve, insofar as it offers hope, insofar as it offers some way, something to connect with other people about. So again, just as we think about this, and I don't want to stretch this metaphor too far because it's not fair, to do this. But as we think about infectious disease, as we think about pandemics, as we think about the way that some things spread, it's fair for us to start to ask questions about what the vectors and the mechanisms for spread for misinformation are, and at least part of that story has to do with us. That it's important for us to not see misinformation just as this alien invader that somehow is coming into our system and mucking everything up, but that part of it is that there's room for traction by virtue of our human tendencies and our nature. And I think that's important, and I'll come back to why here in just a moment. I've spent a lot of time pointing out how human we are, and another wonderful aspect of our humanity is our emotion. Emotion is, I'm not going to stand here and argue against it. Functionally it matters, and it's just philosophically an intricate, important part of our life. But it also can complicate matters when it comes to information processing. And there's been a lot of really interesting work in this regard. And actually some work by a former graduate student of mine, Brian Weeks, just as one example, pointed out the ways in which anger seems to lower the bar for people's acceptance of inaccurate information. And you can imagine what the implications of that work are for the political sphere, right? But I also think it matters quite a bit when we're thinking about health and science, because of all the situations people are in a highly emotional state, when they're thinking about the health and well-being of their loved ones or themselves, and you can think about the vulnerability that might leave for us. So I think that's important as well. We've got to keep in mind that our emotions matter. And part of the reason I like to point that out is that a lot of the academic work that happens in sort of a dry abstraction, in a hypothetical circumstance where people are answering a survey question. And I think it's always better when you can to try to get as close as you can to moments of real life. So, if you're asking somebody about a scenario, and they're very far removed from it, that might be very different than, when it's 3 in the morning and they've been up all night and they're upset and frustrated, right? And so you've got to think about the circumstances that people are in and the emotional states that they're in when they are sharing, when they are reading, when they are encountering, misinformation, when they're grasping for desperately for some, element of hope. Another aspect, of our human brains that I think are that's fair for us to put on the table and for us to consider here is the extent to which we aren't carrying around blank slates in our minds. We have, essentially, one way of thinking about this is our ways of processing, the world are somewhat conditional on our experience up to that point. Our brains are structured in a way that you might think about our cognitive architecture as preconditioning our future engagement. And there's a lot that we could unpack there and think about that. But I think the short story is that our mental models of the world matter, and that can also affect our engagement with information. And there are a couple of ways in which this is going to matter for the issue and dilemma of misinformation, because it might set the stage for the acceptance of certain types of misinformation that is resonant with our understanding of the world. And it might make us particularly vulnerable in situations where there are radically changed circumstances. And that's something that I think is important for us to point out. We do well by drawing on our past experience, but by drawing on our past experience, we might be vulnerable to information that is inaccurate, but that resonates with that experience, as opposed to new information that is actually somehow different than what our experience to that date has been. Why point that out, that twist? Well, you might think about the situation of infectious diseases, which can often present in a way that are different, that's different than what we've experienced previously. So we can think about this, in the situation of, in the last few years we've faced Ebola virus and Zika virus and now COVID-19. And I think part of what's interesting and what we find in the public understanding of health literature, and my colleagues and I have contributed somewhat to this, is that people tend to draw on existing models of disease in thinking about how we ought to respond to the current dilemma. We saw this very early on with COVID-19, where there was an awful lot of reference to the extent to which, and you probably will remember this, COVID as, it's just the same as the flu, right? And that's a limitation that's really important, because it means that we're going to overlook certain aspects of what's new and novel. And you can think about that as both setting the stage for certain types of myths and misinformation which are rooted in resonance with our previous understanding, but it also points out our blind spots. There's a really interesting twist as we looked at public understanding of Zika virus a few years ago. And we were doing this in the context of Guatemala, where unfortunately they had more experience with Zika virus than we did in this country. And in the case of Zika virus, what was really fascinating was that here you're in a situation where Zika virus, like other diseases, is mosquito-borne, and in Guatemala, people are used to dealing with mosquito-borne disease. Unfortunately, there's quite a bit, dengue and chikungunya and other mosquito-borne diseases. What happened, what seemed to happen early on, was that people were using their existing frames of reference to judge this new Zika virus as yet another mosquito-borne disease. And there's certain aspects where that analog is fine, but there's an important twist, and that Zika virus can be sexually transmitted between people. So here's an angle that if you're using your existing frame of reference, you're going to miss that, and then you're going to have a limited understanding. You can similarly think about ways in which certain people might develop counter myths or counter information relative to what's being issued by health educators that are rooted in previous understanding. And that's an important limitation here. So our pre-existing minds, our preconditioned minds, also set the stage for the proliferation of new misinformation sometimes. So as we think about then this human dimension, this social dimension of our dilemma, it casts some of our current situations in new light. There's a really interesting article in the Atlantic magazine a few years ago, thinking about, at that point in time, worry and concern about a new outbreak of measles, and concern about hesitation with regards to vaccination with regards to measles. And the main emphasis in this particular article was the vulnerability that some people shared and exhibited by virtue of their alienation from society. So in a weird twist, not even necessarily weird, but in a twist here, we might think about one of the most important dimensions for this from the standpoint of disease spread was the social condition of alienation, and the situation where people felt the need to bond with or connect with other members in a community. They did so over vaccine hesitancy information, for example. And so that social angle to our public health life is vital. And I think we've seen that in so many ways during this pandemic, of course. But I think that's really important for us to keep front and center as we think about this moving forward. Okay. All right. So we've, I think, made a case for this as a real and serious problem. We can start to understand the roots of it, though, I think in ways that are often not emphasized. What can we do about all of this? Well, I think what we can do, in part, is something that has been sorely lacking, which is to encourage compassion. Now, I want to talk about this in the context of both health and medical professionals. We might think about this in the context of politicians, but also in the context of you all. The extent to which part of our dilemma at the moment is what to do about people that accept misinformation, about the people that spread misinformation. And there's an easy reaction that many of us will share, which is one of disgust or concern, or anger. And I understand that. But I actually think ultimately here that we've got to move to a spot of understanding how it is that misinformation can get accepted by almost any of us under the right circumstances. And to leave the door open for people to come in from out of the cold, and for situations where people shared something online they shouldn't have, to still rejoin our communities. And it doesn't mean we have to accept the false information, but I do think we need to leave the door open for people to rejoin our community conversation. It just seems to be an important path forward. I think this is particularly true when it comes to healthcare professionals, and I'll talk about an example in just a moment where we've used that as the basis for a workshop. I think ultimately we need to do a better job of making sense of the world, of trying to help people make sense of what's out there, and I think that we need more in terms of translation of science than has been the case. Certainly discussions like this are really part of that in really important ways, but I just don't think we spend nearly enough time trying to make information accessible. And as a result, people go looking around on the internet for what they can make sense of, and I think that's a real problem. I think part of that issue is on us. I think we've got to do a better job of figuring out what people are encountering and monitoring the environments that are not part of our own media diet. So you think about, how many of you think that you are regularly, trafficking in and encountering misinformation? I suspect many of you probably don't think there's a whole lot of it, in your own, everyday stream. But we need to do a better job then of figuring out, in other communities or other people, what it is that they are encountering without looking down our nose at it, because in order to help them as neighbors and as community members, I think we have to have a better understanding of what's actually out there in different ways. And lastly, I think we can be doing a better job of empowering people to be critical in their information seeking. While we might be vulnerable to accept misinformation at face value, I do think it's possible for people to take a breath and to engage critical interpretation faculties. So ultimately, I think that partly what we need to do is to shift away from shaming and blaming those who don't trust institutions of science, who don't trust higher education. Instead, we need to move towards building trust with those people. And so we start out thinking about misinformation, and there's this through line that part of our remedy here is actually building or maintaining trust in ways that we haven't tended to sufficiently. So here I want to ask a question as to what it is we actually mean by trust. So a lot of our common definitions of this will really emphasize and focus on credibility, on expertise, on the extent to which somebody knows what they're talking about. And that's an element, that's a really important element for most people's understanding of trust. But some of the work we've done actually suggests that people there are more dimensions than that to trust. And at least one of them that I want to point out is this notion of shared interest. So if I'm standing up here talking as some sort of expert and you think, well, he probably knows some things, but he doesn't really care at all whether I live or die. Chances are you're probably not going to necessarily trust me very fundamentally as a human being. So the extent to which we view sources or speakers as sharing some interest with us, I think that matters. And I think that's something we've tended to overlook. We tend to think about pointing out all of our credibility, the letters after our name, as a reason why you ought to listen to me, when in fact, we actually need to think about what indication of shared interest we've actually offered to our audiences. What is it, in other words, that we can do to actually identify what some of those shared interests are and to put a spotlight on them, to uplift them, and to give people reason to pay attention to us as an information source? So ultimately here, the problem of misinformation, we're not going to rid the world of it. If we try to do that, I think that what you're going to end up doing is like the old carnival game of whack-a-mole, where you're trying to knock that out. It's just, there is always going to be more misinformation that's going to pop up. So rather than trying to sanitize the world of misinformation, there are some efforts that are good and useful in that regard, but that's not the only thing we need to do. I think partly what we need to do is build up communities of trust where people are paying attention to certain information sources that can help lead us through. I tend to think about this in terms of navigating a storm that's already upon us. We're not going to do anything to necessarily mitigate the hurricane out of existence, but we can try to help people survive it and to try to get through it together. And I think part of what we need to do then is to what extent are we reaching out and trying to build communities of trust. This has come up in a number of circumstances in my own work professionally. I had the opportunity, again, pre-pandemic, to do some work with there's an organization that goes by the acronym XSite. It's a European, it doesn't stand for anything really right now, but it's a coalition of science museum professionals. And they were really interested in the dilemma of misinformation and what science museum professionals could do about it. We originally, we designed a 2-day discussion, and their original framing for this was one of warfare. They wanted to know what we could do to combat misinformation. We got a bunch of scientists over here that are really interested in going toe-to-toe and combating this evil of scientific misinformation. And my suggestion was that we drop the war metaphor, that we try a different approach. We try to think about community museums, science museums as community centers, as places to potentially build community, and to focus on that. And you can see that's actually reflected even in the title, ultimately, for what we came up with the workshop was beyond fact-checking, ways that we might address misinformation. I've also been part of a number of discussions at RTI International. We put a summit together a couple of years ago on building and maintaining trust, and explicitly asked the question what role foundations and nonprofits could do, because I think this is explicit and active work that needs to happen. And ultimately here, we came up with some, you might argue, common sense ideas, but nonetheless, I think really important ones. We've got to do a better job of promoting what's known as open science, transparency, the extent to which we make people aware of what it is that we're doing, what the process of science actually entails. Ultimately, we've got to both equip audiences for critical engagement. What we need to think about encouraging scientists to be better in their own communication efforts here. And I think ultimately we need to build in a lot more collaboration and bridge building than we typically do. So the last thing I'll just point out is an initiative that it's been a lot of fun to work on across the way here in Durham over at Duke, in which we've worked with clinicians to address misinformation. In the situation where a patient comes in and they printed something off of the internet that's really outlandish, what's a clinician to do? And there are a lot of principles that we talk about in this workshop that actually are similar to what I've outlined here, in that ultimately we are encouraging a stance of empathy and compassion rather than ridicule and shame. We are encouraging people to think about those crucial conversations as real moments and opportunities to work on something collaboratively with your patient, rather than necessarily arguing them out of their inaccurate stance. This is different than accepting what they say as being true, but instead what you're trying to do is figure out why what they were saying that was not true was nonetheless important to them, what they were trying to express in terms of their values and preferences. And we think that that's a stance that can go a long way, and it's really resonant, I think, with a lot of clinicians who suggest they are doing that in other aspects of their interaction with patients, but typically not when it comes to misinformation. And so this has been very welcome, and those discussions have been really gratifying to have those discussions, which we've moved to do virtually during the pandemic, but which we originally were doing in face-to-face workshops. Okay, so with that, I'm really interested in what you all might have to say about this, but I want to thank you, very much for your attention to this important issue, and thanks again to Flyleaf and to Carolina Public Humanities. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Southwell. What we'll do now, folks, I want to encourage folks online. We have a few questions stacking up online. I encourage you to enter some questions on the question and answer. Brian Southwell will ask questions if anyone has a question in the audience, and just repeat the question. If not, then we'll go right to the online questions. Okay. Questions in-house?
Sense then of vetting that was done by an organization. So I would challenge the notion that we don't want censorship. I very much wish there was a requirement that a person would be held responsible for what they said, and that there was an education about. My mother taught me to consider the source. Meaning the guy in Times Square who's going to sell me a Rolex from his raincoat, I'm not going to believe anything. I don't think the waiting room I take his information in very long. Whereas if Walter Cronkite said it, I take it in for a long time. Yeah. So it feels to me that we moved to news organizations that vetted things with open things with Facebook, etc. And it feels now that there's a shifting, saying there's increasing, but you have to be responsible and have to censor some of Facebook and some of all of that.
Yeah.
So I'm curious that your emphasis is over here on the audio. Can you look at what's your thought about the responsibility of the speaker?
Yeah, thank you so much. And for those that are online, I'll just briefly paraphrase, and hopefully I don't offer, and I'm hopeful I don't perpetrate any misinformation in doing that. But the basic emphasis here is, have I de-emphasized censorship? Have I suggested that there's no responsibility that ought to be had on the part of media organizations and others, and that's really the thrust here. And my emphasis on an audience. And it's an excellent point. And I don't want to suggest that I somehow don't think that there ought to be an obligation to do work that's in the public interest. We know that that's actually a basis, especially as we think about our oversight of the broadcast spectrum. There's an obligation that organizations have to meet that. And philosophically, I think that's a goal that we ought to be aspiring towards. So I do think that there's actually room to say that this is something that we ought to hold people accountable to. You think about various social media platforms. You think about different organizations. We shouldn't necessarily allow people carte blanche, to say whatever. There's a certain degree to which people do have control over what goes through their platform, and they could be held accountable for that. Whether that's a matter of government regulation or collectively, our judgment and use of various platforms or organizations is an open question. So yeah, I think absolutely that there is a role here, for information sources themselves, and there's certainly better and worse and more or less ideal ways for organizations to be using, valuable public airtime, for their work, and so that's certainly fair. and it's going to be part of the equation. Part of what I wanted to do today is just to point out that it's a multifaceted dilemma that we face. And it's one that we've partly gotten into this pickle as a result of our own humanity. But that's not to say that, to go back to the earlier example, not only media outlets, but even individual actors like Belle Gibson, I'm not going to celebrate her as a heroine, per se. There were certainly really problematic things that she did that, and insofar as that could be challenged through law, and she can be persecuted for that, prosecuted for that, that makes sense, and to me, it's a relevant and additional discussion that we could have as part of this. That's great. But thank you for raising that, because I appreciate the point to clarify. Yeah.
Another question in the House?
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, it's sort of a follow-up to what this gentleman had to say, but a lot of times, or not a lot, but I think sometimes this misinformation can be broadcast by scientists and experts.
Yeah.
Not deliberately. To me, science is something that, as new things are discovered, positions change, and that's all part of the scientific process. You raised the issue, and I'm going to combine it with something else, about Guatemala and the Zika virus, and their response to it there, that they treat virus the same way they treat other viruses carried by mosquitoes. And I compare that to maybe a more recent example of mask wearing.
Yeah.
Americans never wore masks. Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, they wore masks for centuries, I guess, for decades even. And it's not new to them. But it was unique or different for us to even think about wearing masks. And early on, I believe, even some of our noted scientists and epidemiologists said masks aren't really going to work in this case. They're not, not necessary. Then suddenly they changed. So that was a kind of misinformation by reliable sources based on their historical perspectives on mask wearing as applied to society.
Yeah. So no, so the one of the points that you raise here is thinking on the origins of misinformation, and making the point that actually under some circumstances, officials that we trust, scientists, journalists, others can all sometimes contribute inaccurate information, which I think is an important point. I think it's important for us to recognize that actually, I can remember definitively. We recently had the anniversary of 9/11, and some of the early news coverage of 9/11 turned out to not be accurate in terms of suggesting that there was a fire on the National Mall, or like other aspects of that reporting during the day. So there's an iterative nature to journalism and to science as well, that sometimes inaccuracies can occur as a result of that. I think it's important, probably something to really emphasize here is that I think we are lacking in public understanding of the nature and process of science. And that's something that we could do a better job of announcing and articulating in advance. Heading into a pandemic even, perhaps announcing that, look, there's aspects of this that are going to change. There's certain parts of this, we're doing the best we can right now, this is the information we have right now. But we don't know everything, and certain aspects of this are going to change. We know that that strategy actually tends to work better than in situations where people are announcing things with absolute certainty. And there's a certain distinction here that I think we can make, in that public communication about some of these results, sometimes there's a confusion. And you've got speakers who think that they need to speak with absolute certainty, when in fact what's needed is absolute clarity. But those things are not necessarily the same. You can be clear about there being uncertainty. And I think that sometimes we need to do a better job of that, rather than necessarily assuming that bluster and certainty, and I'm not suggesting that with regards to any particular person or individual, but I think sometimes what happens is there's a pressure to offer a clear message that seems to be certain. And I think that inadvertently can lead to later being complicated to unwind that. So I think I appreciate you raising that point. Got one more in the room here, and then we can maybe go to one online. Yep.
And I'm going to bring the microphone up just because sometimes the questions.
I'm sorry. Oh, okay. I think when you use the word misinformation, that to me assumes that there is an absolute truth somewhere out there, and I just have a problem even when you begin the discussion about misinformation as to what exactly is, what are we talking about? Is there assuming that there's a truth out there that we're pointing to, and that everything else is just something that has to be dealt with on the side, but somehow if we just really can focus on what the real truth is, that's gonna help us out. And I think to define what we mean by misinformation, that would be a good beginning in this discussion.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and that's certainly, and I anticipated that challenge, which is one that it makes sense that we'd run into that. And earlier when I sort of noted asking the question, what is misinformation, I think is really important for us to do. And here, there's an angle to your worry and concern that I think is really important to emphasize again, probably, which is that if we assume that we're just talking about an absolute truth in the way that we might think about, a chest full of treasure that certain people are in possession of or not, that's dangerous, and it's not accurate, and philosophically there's a lot of challenges that can be made. And I think we run into that problem, particularly when you talk about a dichotomy between scientists as somehow just possessors of the truth per se, as opposed to experienced and trained professionals who are doing the best they can to accumulate knowledge. And that's where I think we sometimes view this in terms of a contest as to who it is that actually holds that truth. And I think that it's important probably to avoid that question. There's an unknowable aspect of our universe. I mean, there's a deeper metaphysical conversation we could get into here. We don't have time in the few minutes that we have for that, right? But I appreciate raising it, because that's probably beyond the scope of as any of us as humans are able to articulate. But I also do think that it seems to be productive, within our human history, to point out that we've been able to predict within a certain realm. We've been able to use science to accumulate knowledge that seems to be predictive, to make sense of the world, to build technologies that my cell phone works because of people using evidence to accumulate, to put that together into a technology. And I think that similarly here, we can think about misinformation as instances that are clearly outside the bounds of the rules people typically play by, especially when it comes to scientific misinformation. Groups of people have worked on accumulating this body of knowledge over time, and somebody runs in and just makes something up that's counter to that. There's a contrast there, and there's a debate and a discussion, and it's dysfunctional. It potentially misleads people. It's distracting from using the best available evidence to make societal decisions as a function of that, and it's a problem. But it's partly a sociological problem, because there is still the question of whether or not we all might be wrong, at some level, and there's a religious question there. I mean, and so that's fair, and I think it's okay. But I think nonetheless, insofar as one believes in and sees value in the practice of science, then there is a question about what happens when people are running way outside the bounds of that and disrupting, the flow of the accumulation of scientific knowledge. Yeah. It's okay. Yeah, I do want to get to that.
We have a quick follow-up.
Well, I mean, what you just said, I mean, I have about 10,000 things I'd like to respond to, but I don't want to take up all this time when other people are. Maybe if we have extra time, I'll speak to it.
But thank you for raising it regardless, because I think that's a really important part of this discussion. So it sounds like online we had some.
Yeah, we have a couple questions here. I'm going to combine, Tom and Miriam Zelo have a question. I'm going to just put them together. The first question was, so in the shared interest model, is everyone's opinion important? And the second question is the need for social interaction and belonging the reason for the popularity of, and the example they use here is Fox News, but I assume any information source. So is shared interest mean everyone's opinion, it matters, and is shared belonging a way we end up sort of being trapped by certain sources?
Yeah. So, there are limitations and challenges to some aspects of this, and I think on some level, and so we can get into a deeper discussion, even just we start to get into the realm of politics and the civic sphere. But of course, we can't necessarily have a situation where everybody, their opinion is necessarily going to win the day, per se. So what I didn't intend to do with that was to suggest a model for deliberation whereby everything is equally weighted and we're in a complete, stalemate, per se. But rather, just to say that I think there is a dimension to perceptions of trust that we sometimes overlook. And that is that it's sometimes about more than one's sense of credibility. It's about the extent to which you view the source or the person that you are potentially trusting as caring about your well-being. And I do think that that's a basis, cynically, that's probably been the basis for some of our polarized politics as well. You can make that argument, but I do think there's an aspect of reality to our dimensions of trust that I think sometimes get overlooked, per se. So the second aspect of that here, I think it's fair to say in terms of why audiences gather. There's a really deep empirical literature on all of that. But the fact that people might have multiple reasons for tuning into a particular news program, I think is fair. And I think it's fair to point out that maybe not all of those have to do with certainty over particular facts, per se. And I think that that's okay to to observe that. So. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions from Paul Connick. Paul would like you to speak to the role of information overload and its role in breeding bewilderment, confusion, and a tendency towards breaking down distinctions between expert, evidence-based information and unfounded, at best, plausible falsehoods. So information overload's effect.
Yeah. So we know that information overload can be really problematic. I think back to my own work 20, 30 years ago, actually. Not quite 30 years ago, but 20, 25 years ago, looking at the impact of very sophisticated or complex editing on what people were able to remember out of media content. And there's a certain point at which you can overwhelm people, and not all of it necessarily is going to be processed or retained. So I think it is information overload is a possibility, given the technologies we have now for information presentation. We might worry about that, and I think that, again, it's partly a matter of thinking about whether people have ideal circumstances for digesting information, or whether some of it's going to be lost sort of in the shuffle or in translation. It's an interesting additional idea there, then, that perhaps there are circumstances where people are in a situation of overload, and that might lower the bar for their critical inquiry, but there's a trade-off. Because on some level, if you're at a point of overload, altogether, you're not necessarily going to just be accepting, all that information. Some of it's just going to, pass by, without necessarily, being embedded, per se. But I think it's an interesting dimension to consider, because it's more possible, than it was when we were just walking around, on the fields or in the woods, somewhere. You can think about how immersed you can certainly be with, multiple screens and a phone and all of that now, and that's something we probably need to think about, in having sympathy for our fellow human information processors. Yeah.
We have a question here from Paul Connick about saying you've steered clear of a judgmental or confrontational approach in tackling the problem of misinformation, one that, for the purpose of analysis, puts aside the role of purposeful disinformation. Yeah. But isn't such disinformation often a critical factor when it is directed at stoking epistemic tribalism that precludes trust?
Yes. I think it's not. It hasn't been my intention to stand up here and to let people off the hook for unethical behavior. I think there's a lot of it that's really problematic, and there's a lot of it that is deplorable. There's a lot of it that is an issue that we really ought to be concerned about. There's no reason for it, but I also don't necessarily think that that's the predominant stance of most human beings out there. I think that there are instances that you can point to, very active and intentional manipulation, but I also think it's an overstatement to suggest that somehow characterizes the whole sum total of our engagement with misinformation. It's out there for a lot of different reasons, and I think that we need an approach that addresses this in multiple ways. I think we're doing a fairly reasonable job in terms of being, you think about all the fact-checking programs that are out there. There are a lot of them, right? you think about instances where there's a headline focus on the 12 people that are perpetrating the misinformation about COVID-19 or about vaccines, right? But that attention takes away from this larger discussion about what else could be done in terms of thinking about the aspects of audience that we've talked about here today. So I'd like to suggest humbly that the remarks today are meant to complement how we're approaching this. They're not necessarily meant to supplant other discussions that we might have about ethics, about responsibility and acting in the public interest on the parts of news broadcasters or others. All that still needs to be, you can have those discussions as well. I just think that we're missing along the way this other role, and I think that there are helpful programs and efforts that could be developed that might make a difference. Just like dealing with a pandemic, it's not anyone's solution. There's probably 3 or 4 things we could be doing that would help to slowly mitigate this. I think similarly with the case of misinformation, there's a lot that could be done, and some of it we've overlooked up to this point.
Great. I have a question online, but I want to open it up to the floor here again if we have further questions.
Yeah, we got one up here.
Okay. Let me get this for you, sir.
I'm concerned about how we as humans are able or unable to take, once we have an answer, to change that. And this may seem left field, but there's a game called the dictionary game, where you pick out a obscure word and everybody writes out a fictitious definition of it, except for the one person who writes the accurate one. After you've played the game, the definitions you remember are the false ones. And this seems to apply here. Like if we get information and we hold on to that, even when we've then gotten the true answer.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Right. I appreciate raising this because there's a really interesting aspect of the social science literature on this that basically considers the possibilities for correcting misperceptions. And there's some worry and concern. There have been some papers to suggest that there are circumstances where there's a bit of a boomerang effect, or that you reinforce the original misperception even by raising it. Some of that turns out in practice to be, empirically there's a little bit of evidence for that, but some of that case has been overstated to some extent, that you can carefully build up a new architecture of a correct perception. It takes a lot of work to do that. But are you ever going to completely forget that fantastical definition per se? Maybe not. But you hopefully can at least build around that an architecture of putting that in context as not being true. So I think the idea of completely there was a movie a number of years ago, kind of maybe silly for some people, but it was the Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, right? And so the idea that we can somehow just eradicate pieces of information altogether, philosophically, there might be some that want to challenge that. But I think, but people have suggested in the corrective literature that we can, under some circumstances, when people are motivated, get to a point of corrected perception. But you're right to point out that it's not necessarily easy. If it was easy, then that would be a mess too, right? Because on some level, the fact that we can hold on to information from moment to moment is our only pathway. The world would be pretty chaotic if from moment to moment we were completely open to new information and to almost a blank slate. So there's a saving grace in the fact that you can remember that definition. It's partly the same thing that allows you to kind of make your way through the world, and remembering things moment to moment too. So a lot of these things sometimes are double-edged swords. But I really appreciate you raising that. Yep. Yeah, come back. Yep.
A lot of, going back, I hate to belabor the point again about the word misinformation that you use quite often. But part of the problem is the way the definition and your emphasis on misinformation is that part of the problem is that misinformation usually has a little aspect of supposed truth in it. And because there's this little glimmer of, potential truth, that's what people, latch onto. And that's how it starts getting, the waters get very muddy. I don't know if anyone saw the HBO series that they did on QAnon, but they did about maybe about 10 or 15 program series on QAnon, and that was just scary as hell. I mean, really scary. But each one of them, and it was more like entertainment. I don't know if anyone saw this, but the QAnon series that HBO did was interviewing the people that supposedly were responsible for all of this QAnon stuff that's out floating around right now, and they would always take this little grain, a little tiny grain of something that had happened, and then put some kind of amazing story around it. And it's just, I'm getting back, the point I'm making is I'm talking about your word that you have started this whole conversation on, is misinformation, and how there's this little kernel of something that called truth, and then it just kind of builds up into something else.
Yeah. No, so I thank you for that, because I mean, there's a pretty weighty and fundamental philosophical concern right at the heart of this, and it's perfectly reasonable to raise that. My stance is, and maybe you won't accept that, and that's okay, but I just think that there is some modicum of possibility for collective agreement, on reality that allows us to move forward. I mean, there was predictive value in your advertisement that went out that this talk was going to happen today, and here I am. I'm here, and I gave hopefully a talk that somewhat fit into the boundaries of what you thought it would be about, and that might be the best we can do, as humans. But I think that there are possibilities where we can, for me, a lot of it turns out to be the predictive value of information, and some information turns out to have predictive value, some of it doesn't, and that which does, we tend to think about as being helpful, information, and the misinformation that's circulating, and the reason we worry about it is that we might worry people are making decisions based on it, and that information doesn't have predictive value, so they're going to be led over that cliff, and that's something that we might think about. So it's a lot to ponder. Whether or not absolute truth exists, we can all think about that over dinner. But I appreciate you raising it, because there is that sort of fundamental philosophical conundrum, and I've invited it by just using the word misinformation to begin with, so it's perfectly reasonable.
It's interesting in that point, just if 1 second, Bob, just say, if I may add, that the notion of that little kernel of truth is that where the plausibility gets in there. If someone can think of something as being plausible, it usually will have something based on something that's true or that's a fact, right?
Well, right, so there are really outlandish things I could say in some made-up language that none of you were aware of that you could label as being accurate, but it's not going to have much traction, right? In order for misinformation to have some traction, you could argue that it probably needs to be rooted in some degree of verisimilitude or some, so that's where there's a bit of a gray area in that, and it's reasonable. So yeah,
I'm going to go to Bob here, and then I have a question from Charlie Lehman online. So Bob.
I experience your approach to most of this, or the solution, as what I'd call very soft power. And I can feel the very soft power again for the audience side. The perpetrators, or perps for short, feels like, pick Alec Jones, for instance. I think he ought to be locked up. Or somebody who's trying to sell snake oil to the little old lady, I think he ought to be in jail. So, and you don't say anything like, we need to be at war with that side of it. Now, I understand your point about whack-a-mole, but that being said, you still can't let people fleece the little old lady and say it's okay. And it feels like you're doing a little bit of, let's just, not be too harsh on anybody and be kind and understanding and all of that, rather than saying, no, reprehensible, not just unethical, but criminal, needs to be stopped.
Yeah, so there's two aspects of that I think are worth commenting on. And I'm speaking just purely representative of no institution here, but just on a personal level, I think that there's a worry and concern that I have sometimes, given certain tools that could be used in declaration of what people think is an act against the state. Well, what happens when somebody else is in that power to be able to do that? So if somebody isn't happy with somebody having red hair or something, right? And so that's something that I worry slightly about just from a purely philosophical perspective. That said, do I think that society could benefit from addressing some of these waste of time and distraction and really criminal behavior? Yes. I mean, I think it's fair to say that. I think that we have a limited amount of time and space to have collective discussion. And just as you all could get frustrated if I were to have wasted your time with some other random talk I could have given. I mean, we can make judgment about how we want to spend our time collectively, and can sanction those that that aren't using that productively. And I think you think about I don't want to make a case here to suggest that lying is okay. Like it's not, right? Under almost any circumstances, you can just make that hardline case, and so then you could build up your judgment and remedy based on that. So I think that's fair to point out.
Thank you for that. I have a question online from Charlie Lehman. To what degree does the lack of respect for credible sources and authorities contribute to the spread and impact of misinformation?
I think it has a tremendous amount to do with it. And I think that, but part of the solution can't just be for us to say, hey, you're not paying attention to these highly credible sources, right? I think that part of it has to be a matter of kind of building up audiences for that over time. But I do think that part of the issue is if we were paying attention to sources that were using rigorous, agreed-upon methods of vetting information, it would be a lot more efficient. It would probably be productive, in a lot of ways. And I'd be the first person. I mean, at some level, this goes to the earlier point. I think there are some information sources that are better and more valuable and more useful for society than others. And I think we can make that judgment. And I think that and so that's something, ultimately here, if we had to select and choose, we can't have people necessarily just paying attention to whatever is out there. I think a part of our way forward, here is to invest in, certain institutions that are, practicing capital J journalism, that are practicing capital S science, and agree that that's a good way of going forward. Let people know in a transparent way what the rules are for how they came to their conclusions, how they gathered their information. But we don't have time to go through, gather all the information we might on our own. So sometimes we have to rely on others. And as long as we know how they've gathered that information, sometimes we can invest in certain credible sources.
We have it's more of a comment in the chat from John Brantley, who says, intentionality, good and bad, helps us understand the effect. Military intelligence distinguishes between misinformation and disinformation. Yeah. And I think
so I view disinformation as a really pernicious subcategory of misinformation that I don't want to eliminate our focus on it. I think that that's something that you could certainly, but I think it's fair to say that misinformation is a broader umbrella. And so I don't necessarily view them as distinct categories, never the twain shall meet. I just think that there's a wider category of noise, because it's not always easy to tell what the intention or who the author was. So it's really more a practical dilemma as much as anything else. But I appreciate you raising that point.
Any questions from the in-house audience? Rebel?
Well, this is just more of a comment, and I don't want to say, I'm sympathetic to what you said about if we could just stop all this, the sources of the misinformation or disinformation. And then I immediately thought, well, it wasn't too long ago that someone perhaps with great authority to do so would label things as false news, false this. And if that person had the authority or the power to cut off those sources that he declared false, we would be in a very bad shape. So it is a double-edged sword. I'm sympathetic and I understand what you're getting at, but I'm glad we're not there.
So the nature of our society, yes.
Just to finish this up a little bit, because I'm sure everybody wants to head home, is that I think it'd be interesting to do a discussion on belief and how belief is how it is that we determine what it is that we believe.
You need to come next week to our talk right here at 3:30.
Yeah, well, so you could say what the talk is about. then.
That I will tell you right now. The talk is Seeking Truth in an Age of Distortion, about epistemology. How do we know what it is we know, and in particular in the context of politics, with philosopher Alex Worsnip. I was going to say that from where Brian is standing right now, but
I wish he was a philosopher psychologist. There's a big difference.
okay. Well, you can ask him that question hopefully next week. I want to put our hands together for Brian Southwell. Thank you so much. Brian, this is absolutely true, and it is a conundrum, isn't it? I mean, I think it's, and if we do live in I appreciate your point, we live in a free society, it's tough to determine. I want to invite everyone, I just gave a pitch for next week. Alex Worsnip will be here, Seeking Truth in an Age of Distortion. Remember, every Wednesday at 3:30, October 13th, Social Media and Democracy, October 20th, Critical Race Theory and the Law, and October 27th, Teaching Hard History in K-12 Education. You can find information on all of that at humanities.unc.edu. Our next Lunch with Friends and Strangers this Friday. Sign up. Come and check it out, folks. Online discussion with Charlene Register about Hazel Scott, who is an absolutely fascinating figure. So if you'd like to come and join us, again, humanities.unc.edu. Come back into frame for one moment. And thank you, Brian Southwell, one more time. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Flyleaf Books. Yay. That's right. Buy some books. We'll see everyone next time. Thank you.